So, Western civilization is arguably a more elusive concept than Chinese, Indian, or Middle Eastern civilization. World history, including the comparative approach, raises interesting issues about identifying Western civ. The post classical period allows some of these issues to be sorted out, though the process must begin earlier. The tradition of teaching Western Civ reflected several factors: an imperialist style belief that the West was possibly the only superior civilization, a concomitant concern born in the ashes of World War I that the West was falling apart and needed historical shoring up, and belief on the American side that emphasis on Western values would help integrate a diverse and suspect pool of immigrants. Thus, Western Civ advocates tended to argue that there was a straight line from the earliest great civilizations to the glories of Western Europe later on. Beginning Western civilization with the river valleys, however, raises two questions. First, what was Western about them? And second, how can we account for the greater legacy of the river valleys of the later East European and Middle Eastern societies? Should the Western tradition then be traced to the classical Mediterranean? Now, this is certainly possible, though there is much about classical Greece that Rome that does not seem particularly Western. The societies themselves, particularly Greece, tended to look eastward. The first disputably Western civilization, in fact, emerged in Western Europe during the post-classical period. It had several features that have survived, and it was, as we've seen, a somewhat underdeveloped borrower during the period. But by the later post-classical period, it was possible to identify a Western civilization and compare it with Asian and African cases. Now we'll focus primarily on two questions with a bearing on the West as part of the post-classical period. First, when can an identifiable Western tradition be identified, and what does that tradition consist of? And second, how do we situate the West in the post-classical world? Now, we've already begun this process by looking at Western Europe as one of several imitating societies with some distinctive twists, and we'll add some factors relating to particular patterns of Western trade and dynamism toward the end of the post-classical period. Now, it's possible to teach a full Western civilization program in the framework of world history. Thus, we'll look at a more subtle issue involving the Western civilization tradition, namely the extent to which the West is sometimes viewed almost unanalytically. Now, we can begin by situating the West among certain other definitional issues previously evoked. Now, it's harder to pinpoint the origins and characteristics of Western tradition than of Chinese or Indian tradition. One problem in looking at the classical Mediterranean tradition as the origin of the West is the extent to which this tradition fed not only the West, but also a number of other societies, including Eastern Europe and the Arab world. This fact makes it difficult to extract exactly what is Western in this tradition. The same thing holds true in the great debate between rationalism and faith. Another problem in overemphasizing the classical origins of a Western tradition involves how much of the classical tradition did not survive, or at least did not survive in any direct sense. Classical Greek and Roman attitudes towards homosexuality did not form part of the West's later tradition. The democratic strand in the classical Mediterranean was not predominant, and its link to the revival of democratic ideas in the late 17th and 18th centuries is almost non-existent. Now, we cannot deny, however, that some aspects of the classical past would survive or be revived in form part of the Western self-perception. Now, some common aspects of Christianity raise questions about the boundary lines between the West and the larger Christian world. But defining the West as a civilization is not as problematic as defining Japanese or Russian civilizations. We're skating here between two levels of definitional difficulty. The West seems harder to define as a civilization tradition than India or China, but easier than certain cases where imitation was even more rampant. Now, an argument can be made that the post-classical period is where we find some distinctive features that become demonstrably and durably Western. The West was defined by Roman Catholic Christianity, where we find some of its organizational features. The Western tradition of Christianity posited a certain degree of separation between the religious tradition and political structures. Now, although these distinctions could be blurred, this separation is different from the East European tradition and Islam. The Western form of feudalism ultimately developed a pre-modern parliamentary tradition. Feudalism was taken to mean that rulers had some obligation to consult with their vassals in making certain crucial decisions, particularly where taxation and budgets were involved. This Western parliamentary tradition appears in Spain, England, and elsewhere by the 13th century and becomes a durable part of Western political structures. A third feature involves the political power and independence of Western merchants in the post-classical period. The West was not the world's commercial or capitalist leader in this period, but Western merchants were less constrained by political regulations and inter-regional trade than was the case elsewhere. Some authorities in Western Europe in this period have argued that through Christianity, the West developed a sense of the superiority of man over nature that resulted in a special interest in new technology. Scholars have posed an interesting argument about a distinctive kind of Western family structure that would emerge at the end of the post-classical period and intensify in the centuries thereafter. In this structure, ordinary people married fairly late, replacing extended family traditions with nuclear families. Now, are we well served in looking at the post-classical period as a formative one for Western Civ? This period is one in which some classical traditions were incorporated or reused, and in which some activities developed as a result of the imitation of other societies. In this period, a set of specifically Western themes emerged in a few crucial areas of political, social, and economic relationships that we can trace from this point onward. Another aspect of the lack of positioning the West in the post-classical period involves, again, the process of imitation. In relation to other societies operating in the post-classical period, the West was rather backward. Western civilization did not command great respect in the Islamic world. Many Western leaders in various spheres of activity felt this gap as well, which is why they proved such eager imitators. Westerners frequently traveled to Muslim Spain and Byzantine Empire and Egypt and were filled with awe at the standards of living they encountered. This gap also explains why the Crusades had their primary impact on the West. The revelation of the difference in living standards between the West and the Middle East spurred new levels of Western trade and consumption. The Crusades also highlighted the paradox of the West's firm conviction that it possessed essential religious truth, but in virtually every other aspect, was a somewhat backward society. Now, the West participated actively in post-classical trade, and this trade increased as Western society gained vigor, particularly from about 900 or 1000 CE onward. But as the West entered increasingly into interregional trade patterns, it did so with two distinct advantages. Some of the goods that were most sought after in the West inevitably depended on Islamic middlemen. Western traders had to go to Egypt or the Eastern Mediterranean to obtain goods from India. China or the Middle East, which meant an additional price to pay in a series of middlemen, and these middlemen were emissaries of a religion that was viewed as heretical and inferior to Christianity. The larger problem, however, was a balance of payments issue. The West wanted spices, silks, and other goods from Asia, but Western manufacturing offered almost nothing to world trade. When Vasco da Gama reached India, he brought with him Western textiles and crude metal products that the Indians were not interested in, because their products were much better. So Europe existed in the post-classical world as an increasingly eager but disadvantaged participant in larger Afro-Eurasian patterns. One response was to become enthusiastic imitators of technological and other developments. Now, towards the end of the post-classical period, certain occurrences began to create new opportunities for the West. Regional competitors encountered new difficulties. The Byzantine Empire declined, and Arab political unities were shattered. And these developments presented new opportunities to borrow technologies from other societies that could help the West overcome its disadvantages. From China, at the end of the post-classical period, the West adopted a number of technologies, including the compass and explosive powder. The printing press, initially invented in Korea and China, was brought to Western Europe and put to use by a variety of inventors. Western political capacities began to improve in the last centuries of the post-classical era with the emergence of feudal monarchies. And frequent military conflict also spurred the West's interest in technological developments that had military applications. Now, textbooks in Western civilizations routinely assume that changes in the West in the post-classical centuries were the crucial determinants of later Western activity in the world as a whole. World historians, however, take a slightly more cautious view. New opportunities for imitation and the results in terms of a new world role came first and inspired internal changes in the West that would amplify the Western tradition.